From the Toronto Star, I'm Raji Mudder, and this matters. There is a global race around the world to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. At the same time, there is a similar race between nations, attempting to secure what they might need once it is developed. The road to a vaccine is littered with ethical and political landmines, to say nothing of the scientific ones, as the world has seen the disastrous results when you get a vaccine wrong. There is no real return to normalcy without one, but already there are plenty of signs that the path forward will not be an easy one. Alex Boyd is a reporter for the Star's Calgary Bureau. She's been writing a lot for our Road to a Vaccine series, and since we all want one, we thought we'd have her on and let us know where things are at. Alex, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So Alex, let's start with Canada's vaccine strategy. I think this is a little bit confusing as it seems our country and our government has signed a number of deals, but right now there's no actual vaccine. So what are we buying really?
So what we have right now is 4 advanced purchase agreements with 4 different biopharma companies. And so you're correct, none of them have a workable vaccine, but what they do have right now is very promising vaccine candidates. So they're showing promising results. They're relatively far along in clinical trials. And so Canada has what's called the Vaccine Task Force, which is kind of a group of pharmacology and drug experts who are advising the government. And they've kind of said, these are our 4 that are looking pretty good. So Canada has signed deals with them that basically says that should one of them be successful, should one of them make it through clinical testing, should it be signed off by Health Canada, we've got an agreement that says, yes, we're looking to buy these. Details like how much we're going to pay, when these are going to be delivered, all these sorts of things are kind of being discussed, though they are keeping them relatively private right now. Bit of a gamble. Should one of these vaccines turn out to not be very successful, it's looking like Canada could lose a little bit of money on this deal. But should one of them turn out to be successful, we've got an agreement that's already in place that says, yes, we want a shot at these vaccines.
But I want to stress how uncertain the environment is at the current time, given that multiple vaccines are in clinical trials at the current time. We are not certain about delivery dates for these vaccines. And so we need to make sure that we recognize that this is a very competitive and uncertain global environment. And what Canada is doing, and I as minister am doing, is to ensure that we have multiple contracts in place with multiple suppliers so we don't put all our eggs in one basket.
Right now, we're not necessarily buying a working vaccine. We're buying ourselves a spot in line.
Now, one of the things that you wrote about is that the reason that the country is putting multiple eggs in many baskets is because there's likely no silver bullet. There will likely be several vaccines that work differently. Now, I love this because you used a toothpaste analogy where some whiten and some are better for your enamel. Now that's all sounds great, but Alex, I really, really want a magic bullet. Is that likely to happen or no?
I think a lot of people would like a magic bullet, and I hate to burst your bubble, but the experts I've spoken to say, you know what, that's probably not very likely. What's more likely is that we're going to end up with kind of a toolkit of vaccines. It's not going to be a question of just kind of one that will solve all of our problems. It'll be a bunch of different vaccines that all maybe look a little bit different. But if Canada has a selection of these that they can use for different people or different situations, taken together, it really could be quite effective. Because, as that analogy alludes to, all vaccines kind of do the same thing, which is that they essentially train the immune system to recognize and hopefully fight back against the virus. But there's a lot of different ways to do that. And that's what we're seeing play out right now. So some of these teams around the world, some of them are using whole virus vaccines. So they're actually using the virus itself to kind of provoke that immune response or try to provoke that immune response. Some of them are targeting the virus's genetic code. Some of them are doing what's targeting messenger RNA, which is a relatively new technology that's getting a lot of buzz right now. So there's a lot of different ways to skin a cat here. And because of that, we could end up with a selection of vaccines that all look a little bit different. Some might last for longer. Some might require 1 dose. Some might require 2. Some might be better on kind of young people versus old. So really what is most likely, according to the experts I've spoken to, is really more of a vaccine toolkit, if that makes sense.
The numbers seem a bit crazy to me. For a country of 37.5 million people, the government is buying almost 200 million doses. Why?
I think it's important to contextualize those numbers a little bit. So as mentioned, Canada has these 4 purchase agreements. And so if we were to buy the maximum amount of doses that we're allowed to buy under those 4 agreements, that's where that 200 million number comes from. But how these agreements are structured is that we're on the hook for a minimum number of doses. And then if we decide this vaccine is effective, it's something that's useful to us, there are options to buy more doses. So assuming in a world, all 4 of them turn out to be effective and that we buy the maximum number that we're allowed to, then we'd end up with 200 million doses. But there's also a situation where maybe we say, we like these 2, they're kind of the most effective for us. So we're going to pursue those 2 and move away from the other 2 that are maybe a little bit less effective. Maybe a couple of them don't even pass clinical testing. So while that's the maximum number, that doesn't mean we're necessarily obligated to buy all 200 million.
There's 2 competing races going on right here. There is sort of the space race to create a vaccine, and then there's also a race for countries to buy these vaccines. You had an epidemiologist mention there's a prestige to getting this first. That feels to me like a really strange way to think about this, but can you explain that? Why is it important for people to get it first?
Fair enough. And I agree. It is a little bit weird. I think it's just kind of one way to look at it, this though. Like, I think it's fair comment to say that it was probably inevitable that politics were going to get tangled up in this a little bit. Russia's claiming to have a vaccine, though kind of the international community is a little bit skeptical there. America has named its vaccine initiative the Operation Warp Speed, which I think kind of speaks to their priorities there. Canada even recently lost a vaccine contender in CanSino after a Chinese company didn't get approval to ship samples here. So politics are part of this. And I think it is a race because I think not only it looks good, but also people really do want to obtain this vaccine for their own people. But at the same time, having had conversations with Health Canada, they've been really, really clear that in as much as we want to do this quickly, it's also very, very important that it's done safely and it's done ethically. And so any sort of vaccine, regardless of who develops it or where it comes from, if it's coming to Canada, it has to pass Health Canada clearance. And so there is kind of an emphasis on making sure that we need to do this quickly. It's important, but we also need to do it safely too.
One of the things you mentioned is that sort of the scrambling for PPE off the top of this might have colored the preparations that the government is making right now. Is that fair to say?
I think it's important to really understand the scale of what's happening right now. I think it's probably unprecedented that we have countries around the world who are all trying to procure vaccine and they all want it as soon as they can possibly get it. And so, in some ways it was beneficial that Canada had this test run with PPE. They were criticized a little bit at the time because a lot of this wasn't being manufactured at home. And so I think they've taken some of that experience into the search for the vaccine in the sense that they've got a bit of a 2-pronged approach. They're trying to secure these international deals. They're trying to make sure that we have agreements in place so that we can get vaccines when they become available. But at the same time, we're also seeing money put into vaccine manufacturing here at home, because of course, that's the other piece of this puzzle. If we have a vaccine, we need to make sure that we're able to kind of manufacture doses in some cases. We need to make sure that we've got, things like needles and antiseptic swabs so that when we get this vaccine, we're also able to deploy it. So in some ways, I think kind of the search for PPE was kind of the training wheels for this, which is kind of the main event, the hunt for the vaccine.
Let's call this the great pandemic space race. How many vaccines and entities are working on them and competing right now out there around the globe?
So it's a little bit hard to know for sure. The most common number I've seen is we've got between 100 and 200 contenders who are somewhere in that process. But, it really is, important to pay attention to kind of where vaccine contenders are in the process. So the New York Times has the most accurate tracker that I've seen in terms of who is where in that process. And they're saying, about a couple dozen in the early stages, about a dozen kind of in the middle. And then we've got the front runners, or what are being seen as the front runners right now. And we're probably looking at about a dozen or less vaccine candidates who are kind of in the later stages of human testing and kind of getting close to some final results.
We'll be right back. Now, here's the thing. We've adopted a bit of a Canada first policy here. Our science and technology reporter, Kate Allen, just wrote a great piece for us on vaccine nationalism. Mm-hmm. And the point there is that while our country might be covered, we need to take care of everybody else. You mentioned something called the COVAX facility. What is that?
So the COVAX facility is kind of the main international strategy to make sure that the global south, that countries that can't afford to do what Canada is doing, which is pouring a whole bunch of money into vaccine candidates, aren't left out in the cold here. And so it's affiliated with the World Health Organization. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is involved. So there's some kind of big international health players here. But how it works essentially is countries like Canada who can afford it can sign on. And then what this facility will do will pool everybody's money, use it to invest in a slate of vaccine candidates. And then should one of those turn out to be viable, they will divide the eventual doses with all of the countries signed up, which includes the ones like Canada who can afford it, but also includes several dozen countries that wouldn't otherwise be able to afford this. So they are dependent on countries like Canada signing up, and we haven't officially committed yet to kind of financing this. But if it works as intended, it means that vaccines will go to countries that wouldn't be able to afford it. And I think, obviously there's a fairly strong, moral public health argument for why, we should make sure that vaccines are available in other parts of the country. But then there's also the argument too that, if Canada is able to control the virus within our own borders, but it's still spreading around the world, that's a risk to us as well.
I think every sort of path or road to a vaccine can be a bit bumpy. I thought it was really interesting that sort of the leading vaccine manufacturers recently made a pledge that they would uphold the integrity of the scientific process.
9 CEOs of some of the largest drug companies in the world just now announcing they've signed on to what they're calling a historic pledge to uphold the scientific integrity and to put safety first as they are developing COVID-19 vaccines.
Hearing that, I think that sounds really great. I certainly hope so. Why did they feel that was necessary?
Right. And I think that announcement took a lot of people by surprise because having 9 competitors come together and sign this totally unprompted, is really unprecedented. And I think what that is about is a lot of people are looking down the road and saying, if we get a vaccine, that's great. But people also have to feel comfortable taking it. And so I think there is concern that people are a little bit worried. And this is something that I've heard from readers as well, that because of the speed at which this is happening, people are feeling a little bit shaky about how safe it's going to be. This is something we've seen particularly fervently, I guess, if that's the right word, down in the States, where there's concerns about pressure being put on some of these companies as the election approaches. And the companies, I think saw this issue and realized people need to feel comfortable that we are still going to do our job. And so they came together and basically said, no, we don't care about the pressure or any perceived pressure that's being put on us. We are going to make sure that all of our vaccine candidates go through testing as appropriate, and we are not going to submit something for approval until we're comfortable with the science behind it. So yeah, it was very unprecedented. And I think it was really about them trying to, reassure people that they are going to do their job here.
This was in part, I think, spurred on by one of the British candidates for the vaccine putting a hold on human trials, right? What happened in that instance?
Right. So that company, they're known as AstraZeneca. The WHO has actually kind of, said publicly that they were one of the global frontrunners. They've got a lot of buzz. They had a lot of eyes on them. But last week, it was reported that they'd put their human testing on hold. And this was because one of the volunteers had an adverse reaction, and quite a serious one, which is usually defined as something that lands you in hospital, basically. So this was not just someone with a sore arm. This was quite a serious reaction. And so what is happening now is they're still kind of looking at the link between what happened and the trial, because, how safety works in these sorts of trials is, how is explained to me that if you're in one of these trials and you leave for lunch and you fall down the stairs and break your leg, the trial still stops because that is recorded as someone who is participating in the trial having an adverse reaction. And it's not allowed to go forward until they're able to kind of determine whether or not that injury had something to do with the trial. And so where AstraZeneca is right now is, I understand, they've resumed testing in the UK, though it's still on hold in the US. And so it's really slowed down what was considered to be a very leading vaccine. But at the same time, I think most people can agree that this is a good thing. This is arguably the system working because someone had an adverse reaction. And regardless of the stakes here, things were put on hold until they were able to make sure whether or not this was safe to go forward.
The current speed record for safely creating a vaccine is 4 years for the mumps. Everyone is racing against time here and is really hoping that we have something in 2021. Alex, is that realistic?
Well, I think it's important to first say kind of where that 2021 deadline is coming from. So the World Health Organization has said that's what they think is realistic. As well, I understand from talking to the Canadian government that our purchase agreements could see vaccine delivered, again, assuming it's developed, assuming it passes Health Canada, could see that delivered as early 2021. So there are people saying that this is a possibility. That said, this is a tall order that we're asking people to do. But what I think is different here, that would maybe be different than, for example, the search for a mumps vaccine, is that we've got teams all around the world. And this is kind of the first time that we've seen that. And as one of the experts I talked to said, it's really amazing when you've got unlimited brains and unlimited resources, what you can really accomplish. But that said, there's also a possibility, like I said, that those first rounds of vaccines, maybe they don't last for very long. Maybe they're not full immunity. A couple of the experts I spoke to said, it might take a little bit longer for a vaccine that's just one shot and gives you kind of full immunity for a longer period of time. So it might be a case that we see kind of a more partial vaccine before that happens. But there's no question that this is going to be a tall order.
Okay, let's get to one of the trickiest things about it, and one of the things that I just find totally fascinating. You've talked to people who have already volunteered to try some of these vaccines, and then a bunch of other people who signed up just to be ready for them. Now, listen, I want one of these things really bad, but there's no way until I hear someone tell me that this is safe and it works. Are these people nuts, or are they just truly altruistic?
You know what? I've spoken to two, one of whom's already, she was actually the first person outside China to be injected with an experimental vaccine, and someone who's just signed up. And my read is that they are very not nuts. I think they really just want to help the community and to kind of be part of the solution. To use one of them as an example, Jennifer Haller, she, kind of by accident ended up being the first person outside China to be injected with one of these. She's kind of become the face of human testing, at least in the States, though she's done media all over the place. And, she said, she was just tired of watching the virus lay waste to her country. There was nothing she could do about it. And so she thought, I'm relatively young, I'm low risk, I'm lucky enough to have a supportive family, to have access to healthcare, to have a good job. This is a risk that I'm comfortable taking, particularly if it, helps the more vulnerable members of my community who maybe, don't feel safe taking that same risk. She said ultimately she's an optimistic person. She's really positive. This has kind of helped her whole life. And so eventually said, you know what? I just decided to trust.
I have so much privilege being healthy. My kids are older. I have friends and family nearby. I have a great job in the tech sector in Seattle. That provides me a lot of flexibility to work from home. I'm going to maintain a salary through all this. I wanted to do something because there's so many millions of Americans that don't have the same privilege that I've been given. This was just something that I could do and that I wanted to do.
It's fair to acknowledge that this is a risk. A lot of these are untested. It is something that, should not be quibbled with. But my read on these people is they just really do want to help.
Clearly, I am the jerk. Anyways, the other thing that you brought up that was super interesting is, and I want you to explain it to us, what is human challenge testing?
So human challenge testing, to be clear, is very risky. It's also not currently allowed, but it's something that there is a growing movement of people who say that maybe, this is like wartime. Maybe it's something that we should consider. So human challenge testing, in a nutshell, is deliberately infecting people with coronavirus in order to test our vaccines faster. So how it currently works, is if you're trying to test your vaccine, essentially, this is obviously massively oversimplifying it, but, you give your experimental vaccine to maybe, half your volunteers or whatever percentage, and then you kind of send them out in the world and see how many of them get COVID. And so by knowing how prevalent COVID is in the community and how much community spread there is, you can then kind of do the math how effective your vaccine is. But if you wanted to do that faster, you would do that same process, but then you would deliberately expose people to coronavirus and see how many people get it. And so to be clear, this is very, very controversial. There's a lot of concern about how ethical this would be, but it would speed up the search for a coronavirus vaccine. And so one of the other people I spoke to, his name is Connor Barnes. He lives in Kelowna. And he said, you know what? I'm young. This is something I want to do to help my community. And so he really feels that this is something that he should be able to consent to if he feels that this is something that would be helpful. So where we're at right now, Health Canada has kind of said, well, no one's applied to do this in the country. So really, we haven't, had to really test this. They kind of can see that there might be something they could learn from it. But at the same time, they'd have to know a lot more about the risks and the issues here. Because to be clear, human challenge testing is something that is used for other drugs. For example, malaria drugs are quite often used through this method. But the key difference is that we have what are called rescue drugs for things like malaria. So say, something goes wrong in your trial, a volunteer gets really sick, a doctor can go in and we have drugs that have a pretty good chance of treating them, of making them better. So there's a safety net there. And we can't say the same thing about COVID. You could have a test, you could expose these people to coronavirus, something could go wrong. And frankly, we have a few little treatments, but we can't say with confidence that we'd be able to treat you if a trial went wrong.
Alex, you've been on this beat for a little while. How are you feeling about this?
It's been a pretty steep learning curve. I don't have a background in vaccines, but at the same time, it's been really interesting because I think outside of, a select group of people who are experts in this field, I think a lot of us are just kind of learning about this for the first time. And I think a lot of people are kind of hungry to know more. The stakes are high. This is something that's going to affect all of us. And, if I can put a small plug here, a lot of the questions that I've put to experts thus far and the stories that I've written have really been shaped by, questions that have been raised by my very smart colleagues in meetings or by emails I've gotten from readers about things they want to know. So if there's something people want to know or you want me to ask the experts, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm very, very open to that.
And we are the same here at This Matters. Alex, this has been fantastic for us. I want to thank you so much for the benefit of your knowledge and taking the time today.
Thank you for having me.
Alex Boyd is a Toronto Star reporter based in Calgary. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raju Mudler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etisaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.